She led me to a stool and I sat mesmerized by the paintings of the artists sitting, silently working in front of me. A lady painting a snowy landscape, another weaving rusty red colors over a barn she'd painstakingly drawn with pencil. A man painting a military airplane using a photograph taped to the upper left-hand corner of the easel for reference. Via bustled over to a nearby cart and came back with a palette and a brush for me. "Now," she said, "you'll want to paint your grays first, for foreshadowing. You'll probably get no further than that today. You'll need to give it some time to dry before you splash on your glorious colors." She opened a jar and poured some brown jelly-like stuff onto the palette next to the colors. "And don't forget to mix your paints with this. It'll help them dry faster." I nodded, picked up the brush, and began painting. No sketching, no reference pictures, just the picture in my mind. Dr. Healer, as I really saw him. There would be a few shadows in this picture. No darkness. Said Bea over my shoulder. "Oh my, yes." And then she moved to another part of the studio. I could hear her whispering gentle instruction to the other artists, giving tender support. At one point, she burst into loud laughter when an artist told her he'd stuffed his cell phone in the blender that morning and turned it on the puree setting. But I couldn't look at her. I couldn't look up at all, not until the outside air brushed the back of my neck again, and I heard Mom's voice, so staccato it didn't belong in the studio at all, float up the aisle at me. "Time's up, Valerie." When I looked up, I was surprised to see that Bea was standing next to me with her hand on my shoulder. "Time's never up," she whispered, not looking at me, but at my canvas. "Just like there's always time for pain, there's always time for healing. Of course there is." Chapter 25. I had just turned the corner of the science hall when Megan shouted out my name and jogged up behind me. I slowed, glanced worriedly in the direction of Mrs. Stone's room, where the student council meeting would be starting in just a few minutes, and reluctantly stopped. "Hey, Valerie, wait up!" Megan yelled, her hair bouncing as she rushed toward me. "I want to talk to you." Normally, I would have definitely kept walking. Megan had made it excruciatingly clear that she thought I was responsible for what happened, and I could guess that anything she'd have to say to me wouldn't be good. But I didn't have anywhere else to turn. The hallways were empty at this time of day at this end of the building. All the athletes were down in the field house. Everyone else had already caught their rides home. "Hey," she breathed again when she caught up to me. "Going to the student council meeting?" "Yeah," I answered uncertainly, crossing my arms over my chest defensively. "Jessica asked me to." "Cool. I'll walk with," Megan said. I looked at her for a second longer and then slowly began walking toward Mrs. Stone's room. After a few steps, she said, "I like your idea about the time capsule. It's going to be pretty cool." "Thanks," I said, and we walked some more. I bit my lip, considered, then said, "No offense or anything, but why are you walking with me?" Megan tilted her head to the side, seeming to consider this. "Truth? Jessica told me I had to be nice to you." "Well, not really told me, but, she got kind of mad at me for shutting you out, and we had this fight about it. We made up and everything, but I decide she's right. I can at least try," she shrugged. "You don't act mean or anything. Mostly, you're just quiet." "I don't usually know what to say," I said. "I've always been quiet. It's just not been very noticeable before, I guess." She glanced at me. "Yeah, you're probably right," she said. We could see Mrs. Stone's room up ahead. A light was on inside, and we could hear voices spilling out of the doorway. Mrs. Stone's voice hovering above them, a few laughs punctuating the air. We stopped. "I wanted to ask you something," Megan said. Somebody told me my name was on the hate list, and I was just wondering, why? I mean, a lot of people are talking about how the victims deserved what they got and stuff because they, bullied Nick. But I didn't even really know you guys. I never even talked to him." I pressed my lips together and wished more than anything that I was already in Mrs. Stone's office, with Jessica as my buffer. Megan was right about one thing. We didn't really know her all that well before the shooting. We'd never really talked to her or had a gripe about her personally, but we felt like we knew her well enough, given who she hung out with. I remember the day Megan's name was added to the list. Nick and I had been eating lunch when Chris Summers and his stooge friends walked past our table, practically owning the commons, just like always. "Hey, freak," Chris said. "Hold this for me." He pulled a wad of gum out of his mouth and dropped it in Nick's mashed potatoes. His buddies burst out laughing, hands on their chests, stumbling around like they were drunk. "Oh, man, that's disgusting. Good one, man. Enjoy those potatoes, freak." They ambled over to their table, talking, taking their laughter with them. I could see the anger boil up in Nick, his eyes darkening and dulling to black holes. His jaw clenched. It was different than he'd been that day at the movies. Then he looked sad, defeated. Now he looked pissed. He started to push himself away from the table. "Don't," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. Nick had been busted for fighting twice already that month, and Angerson was threatening suspension. "They aren't worth the time. Here, just eat mine." I pushed my lunch tray toward him. "I don't like the potatoes anyway." He froze, his nostrils flaring, his palms pressed flat against the table. He took a few deep breaths and lowered himself back into his seat. "No," he said softly, pushing my tray back toward me. "I'm not hungry." We ate the rest of our lunch in silence, me flicking glances at Chris Summers' table behind us. I memorized the kids sitting there, Megan Norris among them, all practically bowing to Chris like he was some kind of god. And when I got home that night, I opened my book and wrote each of their names down, one by one. Seemed really justified at the time. I hated them all so much for what they were doing to Nick, to me, to us. But now, standing in the hallway outside Mrs. Stone's classroom, everything felt different. Standing in the hallway outside Mrs. Stone's room, Megan wasn't so horrible. She was just another confused person trying to get it right. Just like me. "It wasn't about you," I told Megan honestly. "It was Chris. You were sitting with him at lunch one time." I trailed off, realizing that no matter how mad Nick and I had been that day, no matter how mean Chris had been to Nick, given everything that had happened, it just wouldn't make sense to her. It barely made sense to me anymore. It was stupid. No, it was wrong. Fortunately, Jessica stuck her head around the door jamb of Mrs. Stone's room and peered out at us. "Oh, hey," she said. "I thought I heard voices. Come on, we're about to start." She disappeared back into the room. Megan and I stood out in the hallway awkwardly for a few minutes. "Well," she said at last, "I guess it doesn't matter anymore anyway, right?" She smiled. It was forced, but not fake. I appreciated that much, at least. "I guess not," I said. "Come on. If we don't get in there, Jess will start throwing a fit." We walked into Mrs. Stone's room, and for the first time, I did it without feeling like running away.